Hello everyone, and welcome to this session exploring notions around genders and sexualities within the wider context of determinants on health. My name is David Evans, and I'm a National Teaching Fellow and a Senior Lecturer in Sexual Health at the University of Greenwich. Our intended learning outcomes for this session will show how we will explore gender and sexual orientation from the perspective of their impact on health and well-being, and especially within the context of sexual behaviours and sexual health. But right at the very beginning, it's worth me asking you to get some paper and pen handy for this session, because there will be a few opportunities that I'm asking you to reflect on and consider some answers so that you can feed back to us on your Moodle forum site. And at least that way, we can be sharing ideas with one another in this safe learning environment. So, the two different concepts on the screen at the moment. The first one, exploring gender. Just stop for a moment and consider what that term means for you. More often than not, the concept of gender is usually written down as sex, meaning our biological sex. So, for example, when we go to fill in official forms, we might be given a dyadic option. That means a twofold option, where we're asked to say whether we're male or female. But how many other different genders can you think of over and above male and female? Take a moment. Okay, no doubt you've heard of transgender. Some people refer to the term as being trans persons or transsexuals. Then there may be people who identify as intersex. So it just goes to show that there are more than just two genders. And if we're expecting people to fill in one or the other, especially if they don't consider themselves to be fitting in so neatly to that biological category of one or the other, then it means right from the start we're excluding certain individuals. So gender is important, especially in the way across the world and right throughout history. For example, one gender often appears to influence rather a negative form of power and control over other genders, and we'll explore more of that later. Similarly with sexual orientations or sexual identities. You're probably all familiar with the terms heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, gay, lesbian. So many different words at the moment expressing people's identity or their sexual orientation. But again, in many cultures, there might not even be words for some of these orientations, because there seems to be an automatic assumption that everybody is heterosexual. And that's another concept that we'll come on to in a little bit. But not only are there people who have different sexual orientation labels, but the very fact that we may assume that everybody is heterosexual or straight to start off with means that anybody growing up realizing they don't fit into that expected norm will then feel that they either have to conceal that aspect of their lives, conceal their identity, or there's this whole notion about coming out, and that means that they're going to reveal something about themselves. Especially within stigma theories, a lot of work has been written on something called concealability and course, or the outcome of something. So if an individual realizes something about themselves that others may not be comfortable with, so a stigmatized condition, for example, then the onus is often on them either to hide it, to conceal it, and if they conceal it, what's going to be the outcome of that? Or they may actually come out about it. And that's why it's really good that the image on your screen at the moment is accentuating this whole idea of people coming out, because that's another contested term and something that's not just as simple or taken for granted for many individuals, especially if they feel that they'll be the object of stigma and discrimination if their identity is known. But it also begs further questions as well. Why is it that in most societies we automatically expect non-heterosexual people, so lesbian and gay for example, why do we expect them to come out, and yet there's no similar expectation on heterosexual people? So let me ask all the heterosexuals who are listening to this presentation at the moment, at what age were you when you realised that you were straight? Who was the first person you told that you were straight? What sort of reception did you get if you went home and told your family, your parents for example, that you're straight? Now, when you think about that, for the majority of straight people, they've never had to go through any form of process of coming out in the way that's expected of many non-heterosexual people. So that's another aspect that we need to consider as an impact on the wider determinants of health. But also there are lots of people who, for one reason or another, may not even like using labels. So they may not want to identify with a particular label for themselves, or they may even say that at this moment in life they're questioning, that they're not too sure, they haven't decided whether they're going to use a label, what that label is going to be. And sometimes this shows that there are at least 3 dynamic areas of sexuality that we need to consider. One is identity labels. So some people like the idea of using an identity label for themselves. But other people may find that their attractions towards other people sexually don't necessarily match up with the label that they're using for themselves. And thirdly, the other dimension then would be to do with behaviours. So, for example, you may have somebody who says that, say it's a man and he declares that he's a married man, his partner is female, but occasionally he's attracted towards other men. Or maybe for one reason or another, he's in situations where he actually has sex with other men, and yet he wouldn't use the label of being gay or bisexual. So whether we're talking about genders or sexual orientations, we really need to move away from this idea that everything is either one or the other, black or white, gay, straight, male, female. There are a lot more areas or dollops of grey in between these shades. So we need to consider that. But even when we're talking about questioning, sometimes, for example, you may see all these different abbreviations of LGBT, so that normally stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. And then sometimes you might see a Q. Sometimes you might see it with a capital Q or even a small q. And what that can represent, especially with a capital Q, it might be for people who like using the label for themselves as being queer. Now, certainly when I was a child growing up, queer was a very negative term to use towards an individual. So if somebody was called queer, it was always a nasty term and used in a derogatory way. But it's one of the terms that many people are now actually reclaiming. And there are quite a few reclaimed words, and this is one of them. Because if a word is used against you in a nasty or derogatory way, but if you then start using that word yourself and look at it in a positive dimension, then it takes away any negative power that's used against you. So the term queer, for example, there are lots of people who are now happy with describing themselves as being queer, especially when the opposite of that is seen to be straight. So if people are talking about living in the straight world, for example, then some people are quite happy to be queer to that, opposite of that. So that's where the term queer is sometimes used. But also it's now becoming a respected academic discipline, and many universities will have courses on topics such as queer theory, queer phenomenology, queer theology, queer psychology. There are lots of academic disciplines now that are wedded to the whole notion of queer theory. And that's often perceived as being a critical or challenging theory, because it certainly looks at what a society perceives to be normal and even questions this whole concept of normality. Because just think about this for a moment. If you say that a person's sexual orientation, say for example in relation to heterosexuality, if you say that heterosexuality is the norm, Just by using that term, norm or normal, ask yourself, what's the opposite of normal? Now, you're either going to come out with the answer that the opposite of normal is abnormal or even subnormal. So we have to be careful in the way in which words are used. If you describe somebody as being normal or natural, what are you saying about somebody that you wouldn't use those terms for? So getting back to the Q, the big Q can stand for queer, and here I'm suggesting that maybe the little q stands for questioning. Somebody who says, well, look, I'm growing up in life, I'm having different relationships with people, and I'm not happy to use a label for myself at the moment. I'm just happy enough just questioning. All right, so let's not get too stuck on too many of these words, because here's another one now, a fairly recent usage, where some people may say they're bi-curious. So if a bisexual person is described as somebody who has sexual relations with both genders of male or female, then someone that's bi-curious may say, well, look, so far in my life, I've only had sexual relations with an opposite sex person, but I'm just wondering what it's like to have sex with somebody of my own gender. But up until this moment in time, maybe they've done very little about it. So that's someone that may be happy with considering themselves to be bi-curious. Or then, now I'm playing around with words here, somebody who considers themselves to be trisexual. And certainly the singer Robbie Williams said this a few years ago. He said he's trisexual, and by that he meant that he'd try anything at least once. And another fairly new word is now talking about people who would describe themselves as being heteroflexible. So the usual identity they may use of themselves is heterosexual, but occasionally they may have attractions or practices or behaviours with people of their own gender. So they may want to describe themselves as just being heteroflexible. And all of these terms show us that we can't just pigeonhole people into set categories. It's important that we're actually considering so many of these terms because they really can have an impact on the wider determinants of health of individuals. So here, let me ask you to pause again and consider these two terms here. What do you understand by sexual preference and sexual orientation? Consider this for a moment, please. Let's go with the sexual orientation first. I've already mentioned that there are some theorists who are called queer theorists, and they would challenge the whole notion around sexual orientation. Why do we even need labels in the first place? But there's another type of theory as well, and that's usually called lesbian and gay theory. And within the LNG theories, the lesbian and gay theories, especially over throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, they clearly moved towards notions of sexual orientation being similar to, for example, to ethnicity. So whereby a person can't choose what colour their skin is going to be, or what ethnicity they have, so with sexual orientation. And people who ascribe to this would therefore say that our sexual orientation is immutable. It's not something we wake up one morning and say, oh right, I'm 8 years old and I'm going to decide to be gay. We're not making a choice. It's not a preference that way. But that somebody is gay, is heterosexual, is lesbian, that's the idea of orientation. And this really taps into debates that have been happening for many generations now as to whether one is born gay or becomes gay. Is somebody born straight or becomes straight? Okay, so and even in relation to genders, look at the way in which young boys are treated differently to young girls in so many cultures, whether that's anything from the colour clothing that individuals wear, to the toys that children play with, even to the expectations of them. So say, for example, if a little boy is crying at a bereavement, and then you may hear adults saying, "Oh, don't cry, big boys don't cry." There's an expectation that boys and men don't cry. Now look at all the negative associations that has later in life when men bottle up their feelings so much that it therefore becomes unhealthy for them because they're not able to discuss or share their feelings. So the impact of genders and sexual orientations are really key right from little baby days onwards in the way that people are treated. When it comes to sexual preference, that's a totally different kettle of fish, because certainly choice is often seen to be key to preference. So, for example, you might enjoy having sex with the light on, or in the dark, or indoors or outdoors, dressed in leather or rubber, or after a romantic dinner. There are so many ways in which we choose the types of sex and sexual relations that we may enjoy, especially those that we can enjoy more than others. But lots of people don't have this choice at all, and that's important to bear in mind as well. But with regards to sexual preference, the way in which these two terms often get confused is that if individuals consider them both to be the same, therefore, if somebody comes out as being lesbian or gay, for example, so it's a young person coming home and telling their family that they realise something about themselves, this is who they are. If the parents think that this is a sexual preference, then they might even say to the young person, well, we didn't bring you up to be like this. You don't have to choose that way. You choose to be something else. And that something else is often that perceived norm of being heterosexual. So we need to be clear as well about the difference between orientation and preference. So certainly from sexuality studies such as lesbian and gay studies, for example, from those particular theories, sexuality is seen as something key to an individual. It's immutable, unchangeable within an individual, whereas preference is to do often with the type of sex or the way in which we express ourselves as gendered beings and sexual beings. But again, think around the world, especially with this dyad of male and female. Look at the way in which women in many cultures have to dress very differently to men. And in many cultures, it's the men who make the rules of how both genders are allowed to be. But also, as I mentioned earlier, with the small queue for questioning, there are lots of people who might say, well, look, it's nobody else's business. And let me give you a really good example here. When people go into hospital and they're having notes written about them, sometimes you might see on the notes, there's a little box on there that just says sexuality. Now, this was built on key nursing theories of the 1970s and 80s, which spoke of the activities of daily living. So on the admission forms, it would ask a person's name, age, date of birth, religion, sexuality. And quite often, many of the people filling these forms in weren't too sure what to put in there. So if it's a woman they're admitting, they might write silly little innuendos like lives at home with husband and 2 children. Or if somebody then says that they're lesbian or gay, if that goes on those medical notes, could that have a negative impact on the care that they receive? And one person even said to me that she saw written on the notes once, over 40. Okay, so it's really important that we consider what we mean and understand by sexuality, and especially for people who are discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. So lots of people may turn around and say, well, look, it's none of your business anyway. Why do you need to know this, and how is it going to impact on the care that we're sharing together? Now, at this point, I'm going to ask you to do something called a force field analysis. So these 3 slides now, I'll present these to you, but you may want to pause the video and work through the force field analysis. A force field analysis just means that you're going to put an aim or something you want to achieve in the middle of the page so you can see exactly what you're looking at, and then consider all the aspects that will work against it, and they're called restraining forces. So our aim here is to assess the impact. Okay, that's what we're looking at, the impact. To assess the impact of genders and sexualities on health and well-being. Now, if that's what we're trying to do, to assess the impact, what will be the restraining forces? What are the things that will hinder us achieving good health and well-being in relation to gender and sexualities? And what are the things that will help, the facilitating forces? Don't worry, I'll come back to this slide in a few moments' time. But one way to do this would be to choose a name from each of the 4 categories here and focus that as the health and well-being of the individual that you're looking for. So in relation to number 1, for example, you may say, well, okay, I'll focus on the sexual health and well-being of females. From line 2, you might choose straight. From line 3, you might choose a young person. And from line 4, you may choose a white person. So you're going to be doing a force field analysis looking at the impact of gender and sexualities on their health and well-being of a female, straight, young, white person. Okay? So you can come back to this, choose which group you're going to do, or you may say that you want to look at male, gay, old, black. Just choose anyone you want to and use that fictitious individual at the centre of your force field analysis. And here it is, back on the next slide. So for the force field analysis, you want to put your aim in the middle. So you want to assess the impact of genders and sexualities. Okay, and here we are back to our slide on the force field analysis. So considering the individual you want to look at, so you might have chosen that you wanted female, straight, young and white, for example. If that's what you're doing, consider that person in the middle of the page here, and what you want to do is to assess the impact of genders and sexualities on that individual's health and well-being. So what is it like to be female, straight, young and white within the UK? What are the restraining forces that will hinder that individual from achieving good sexual health and well-being? And what are the facilitating forces? So you might say, well, a restraining force is that in our society and culture, females don't often carry condoms with them as often as males might. And that's debatable anyway. But you might say that they don't do this because if they're carrying condoms with them, there are stereotypical images within our society that would have negative labelling for women who carry condoms. Now, that's a real poor indicator leading towards somebody's sexual health and well-being. So that would be a restraining force. Whereas a facilitating force, you could say, well, the exact opposite. There are so many sexual health services, especially for young heterosexual females within the UK, that there's easy access, and some may say no excuse, for people to access these services to promote their sexual health and well-being. And that's certainly by using effective contraception and barrier methods such as condoms to prevent infections. So that would be your force field analysis. So you might want to just pause the tape here at the moment and work through this, and then certainly give us some feedback on your Moodle site. When you've done it, feel free to restart the video again. Another problem around genders and sexualities are to do with all the various stigmas. And stigma literally means a mark or a sign. So, for example, the very fact that I'm wearing glasses is a mark or a sign, it's a stigma, that I've got something wrong with my eyesight. And some stigmas are visible to others. So, for example, if I was a wheelchair user, you'd see me sitting in a wheelchair. And that's the mark, the sign, the stigma. The sign or the stigma. But for some individuals, whether it's about their gender or their sexual orientation, they may not wish to reveal that to others. So there's this whole process of concealability. Especially in relation to young people, look at the way in which society often treats children as being sexually innocent. And certainly in modern times, with all the various discourses we're having about child sexual abuse and exploitation, we can see that the whole notion of childhood innocence is something that's questionable. But arguably, it always has been. Even in Victorian times, the way in which sexuality was dealt with then has been rigorously scrutinized by a really useful French philosopher called Michel Foucault. And this whole concept of childhood innocence is something that does need to be explored more, because the impact on health and well-being can be detrimental to young people. Look at the number of schools across the UK, for example, that don't provide effective sexual and relationship education and resources for young people. And that's sometimes because older individuals, parents and school teachers may think, well, we have to preserve their innocence and we don't want to tell them about sex too young, because if we do, they're all going to run out and do it. But we can see from the statistics on sexual infections and teenage pregnancies that lots of young people are doing it anyway. So this whole notion of childhood innocence is something we need to critically explore. Because if lots of people are having sex, but some of them are suffering poor consequences of it, then certainly by giving effective sex and relationship education, then what we're doing is skilling people up with the knowledge, skills, and hopefully the resources on how to do whatever they're doing much safer than they are. Okay, it's no good us burying our head in the sand and pretending, well, if we don't talk to them about it, they won't do it, because we know that they are doing it. But what we can do is enable people to be safer with their lives. And also, when we're talking about sex and relationship education, look at the way in which many young people, and the reports on them, say that they still complain about SRE in schools because they say that SRE is too often too little, too late, too biological, and too reproduction orientated. So say, for example, if young people in school are only having a limited amount of information on sex and relationships, and it may be in relation to how to make babies or how to prevent making babies. But supposing you've got a boy in the class who thinks, well, look, we're having this lecture on reproduction, but I don't need to know anything about this at all, because I don't want to reproduce, because I fancy the boy sitting next to me. Now, who's talking to him about safer sex? Who's talking to him about the risks of sexual infections, including HIV? Who's talking to him about there is still no vaccine against HIV and no cure, and that condoms for anal sex could really help prevent passing HIV from an individual that has it to an individual who hasn't? But also that taps into wider ideas about sex as well, because here in the UK, many studies show that there are numerically more heterosexual people who have anal intercourse than the number of gay and bisexual males. So even when a young gay person is old enough to go into gay bars, for example, they might see posters and leaflets and free condoms, all encouraging condom use for anal intercourse. But numerically, more heterosexual people are doing it. Some women in some cultures, for example, have to be vaginal virgins when they get married. So they might have oral or anal sex and don't even consider that having full sex because they're not having vaginal intercourse. And yet, if they're having anal sex without using condoms, they're certainly at risk of a number of sexual infections, including HIV. So do you see again how the impact of both gender and sexuality can have an influence on the wider determinants of an individual's health? I mentioned a few moments ago about Michel Foucault, and when he was looking at sex within the Victorian times, he came out with this really good question when he asked why we still burden ourselves today for once having made sex a sin. And Foucault showed that down throughout many, many centuries, because sex was often talked about within various religious contexts, And any sex that wasn't reproductive within marriage, for example, was seen to be sinful. And even here in the UK, religions are now in a minority, and the religious influence is not as strong as it used to be. And yet there are still notions in which religion tends to get a message across that sex is still sinful. So some individuals may suffer shame or guilt because of the type of sex that they're having, and maybe that is because once sex was considered to be a sin. Foucault also spoke about something that he referred to as the triple edict, and by that he was talking about anything which is a taboo, therefore treated as non-existent and not discussed or silent. So if there's an aspect of gender, let me think of another one now. Say, for example, especially in cultures where families are really encouraged to have lots and lots of children. And supposing you have a couple where one of them are infertile and they can't have children at all. Within their particular culture, that may be seen that if it's a woman, for example, that she's not fully a woman if she can't bear children. And that's something that will be then treated as a taboo and something that's not discussed, so it's covered in silence, and therefore it doesn't even seem to exist. So Foucault said there are lots of aspects about sex and genders which are covered in this triple edict. Now, here's another little exercise for you again, but at this point what I'm going to ask you to do is take care of yourselves. I'm not forcing you to say or do anything that you don't want to. I'm just asking you to consider, when you were younger, what were some of the personal messages you received from adults, both on gender and sexuality expectations? Okay, the second point is, how did these messages tap into various gender or sexualities stigmas? And what impact might or could these messages have on a person's sexual health and their well-being? I suggest you pause the video at this point. So, considering the first one, what messages did you receive from adults? So, many young people are told that little boys behave in certain ways and little girls behave in very different ways. So, if a little boy gets a slap from somebody in school, then you may hear adults saying, well, go on, show him how tough you are. Don't let him hit you, otherwise he's bullying you. Hit him back. Show you're stronger. Whereas if a little girl gets slapped, she may be expected to relate in a totally different way, and certainly for a little girl to go and fight somebody wouldn't be seen as a feminine trait. But these whole ideas of masculine traits and feminine traits, where are we getting these from, and what's the impact on individuals? So what messages did you receive about, like, what should little boys do and what should little girls do? How do they behave? So you may say, well, little boys were always expected to play with manly toys, so they might play with big cars, trucks, lorries, action man, soldiers, all that type of thing, and girls were often given dolls, kitchenware to use, and it's as if we're sort of stereotypically expecting these small children to grow up in particular ways, and that these are the role models that they're being given. But how might some of those messages tap into stigmas and discriminations? So supposing a girl decides, well, I don't like playing with little dollies, I want to play with my brother's Meccano set. Or I want to be the only girl on the boys' football team. Look at the way in which stereotypically she might be thought of as being a tomboy, or that she's very masculine, not very feminine. Now that's the way in which stigma and discrimination can then be attached to certain individuals. And certainly considering the impact on these throughout a person's life. When you're ready, start the video again, please. But all of the differences that we're considering here, whether it's to do with genders or sexual orientations, just think of your own family. Not everybody fits into the same mould, and especially when we're talking about lesbian and gay people, yes, they are other people's daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, people down the street, whatever. But certainly in the past, there was this an assumption that everybody was meant to be heterosexual unless proved otherwise. Now today we can see that people are being more open about different sexual life ways and orientations. It's also worth remembering as well that in the UK's Equality Act of 2010, there was a clear duty that that services, such as the National Health Service, for example, has to take into consideration the impact of gender on individuals. Now, you might think, well, all hospitals should be treating everybody equally. But because women have often not had the types of services suitable to them, you may find some hospitals will even have a Women and Children's Directorate or Women and Children's Services. But let's stop there and consider this again. Why are children always with women? Do you ever see a Men and Children's Directorate? If not, why not? And what about women that haven't got children? Maybe they don't want them, can't have them, for one reason or another, they haven't got them. Are they then welcome in part of the health service that's described as being for women and children? And if they haven't got children or can't have them, how are they going to feel being lumped into services with everybody else who will have children? So we must look at gender and consider how it affects people differently. And again, being rather stereotypical in what I'm going to say here, look at the way in which our society often assumes that women are more proactive at accessing health services. So you might find that more women access the GP practice. More women may generally talk about their feelings. But when it comes to men, men often leave things far too late. And by the time they do go for a healthcare consultation, a condition they've got might be too far advanced for treatment or even for them to sustain their lives. So testicular cancer is a really good example here, that you may get some men who will ignore a lump in their testes, but if they ignore it for too long and do nothing about it, if that lump happens to be cancerous, then that person could suffer the consequences of cancer, and for many of them it may relate in death. However, if they'd only access the services nice and early, testicular cancer is one of the best cancers to be able to treat and cure at a very early stage. So we must consider the impact of genders on health. And it doesn't mean that we can just say, well, okay, we're going to pay attention to gender. We actually have to do it. If you say that you're visiting a GP practice and most of the people in there are females, where are all the males, many of whom may equally have healthcare needs? And if you say, well, they're all at work, or they're all in the pub, or they're all at the football stadium, then maybe we need to reorganize our services to go and meet the men where they're at. But again, we can't just think that all women are the same and all men are the same, because whether it's to do with genders, age, ethnicities, sexual orientations, physical abilities, mental abilities, all these different things have an impact on why people's sexual health and well-being may be healthier in some people and not so in others. So it's really important that we consider all of this. So when it comes to gender awareness, we can't just put on the occasional campaign, we need to do something about it. When we're talking campaigns, think for example of breast cancer awareness. Think how widespread that is. Think of the colour ribbon that's worn for breast cancer awareness. Think of the number of charity events for breast cancer awareness. Now ask yourself, how much do you know about some of the male cancers? How about prostate cancer? Or how about testicular cancer? Or how about cancers that can affect all people, such as bowel cancers? Now, if an individual has something wrong with their bowels, again, their gender and their sexual orientation may mean that some people feel more comfortable talking about this, other people feel less comfortable. And if they leave it too late, there's a negative impact. So a restraining force on their health and well-being. And especially when we're thinking of sexual behaviours and how they can relate to sexual health, it's the impact that's going to be really crucial here. And a very good way for you to check out some of the sexual health indices are to go onto the Public Health England website, so phe.gov.uk. And if you just type in the search box sexual health profiles, a really good website will open up for you, and you can put your own local town or area, and you can compare that with the next borough, for example, or with your county, or even with the whole of England. And you can compare it on numerous indices. So it may be that you want to check out what's teenage pregnancy like in your borough compared to the neighbouring borough. Or what are the HIV statistics? So teenage pregnancy, HIV, sexual infections, and you can even compare these with a person's social condition as well. Now, another aspect that can often bug people around their sexual orientations and their genders is to do with low self-esteem. What you can see on this slide, the three key aspects in the middle show that if a person has low self-esteem, quite often they may not give a damn about themselves. So even if you're encouraging people to use condoms to protect themselves against sexual infections, for example, if somebody doesn't even care about themselves or feel that they don't deserve care about themselves, then that individual is at risk with low self-esteem. But many people with low self-esteem, it's not just a case that they don't care for themselves, but at the same time, they might be craving for love and attention. And on the other hand, they might be frightened of being rejected. And certainly some of the other signs around your screen here will show you how the low self-esteem can be complicated. So let's just take one here where it says the thrill of risk-taking. Look at the way in which young males often take more risks in life, whether this is driving cars in a risky fashion, having lots of unprotected sex. A lot of young males do take more risks than females and than older people, for example. And if they're taking risks and say a parent says to them, well, look, don't do that because that's risky. Look how that's an encouragement for some people to do it. But if an individual's got low self-esteem, then they might even want to take risks so that they won't get bullied by others because they seem to fit in with the peer pressure that's going on. And this really taps in well with some of the terminology. I said to you earlier that as a child, if somebody had said an individual's a queer, that was used in a very derogatory way. But look at the way in which the word gay is being used by so many people these days. Again, usually in a derogatory way. So say, for example, if a young boy isn't seen to be as manly as all his peers, then someone might say, oh, you're so gay. So now it's being used in a very derogatory way towards some individuals. So if that young boy has then got low self-esteem because of the way he's being bullied, he might think, right, well, if I prove I'm not gay, then all my friends will like me. So desperate for love and attention and frightened of being rejected. So therefore, this individual may take more risks to try to prove they're not what the negative term is being used against them. And right in the bottom hand corner here, one of the little blurbs says freedom. Because although many of the signs on this page are quite negative, also for people who are suffering with low self-image or low self-esteem, they may then come to a realization that they have got a freedom to do something about it, and certainly look at ways of using resilience to boost their self-esteem. And we'll come back to this a little later. It's going to be really important for you to explore some of the terms that will appear on these next two slides. And I'll just go through them briefly. And the reason why it's important is because of the impact that some of these words can have. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the term racism. Now look how racism has hatred and dislike actually built into it. Whether it's somebody using a racist slur towards somebody else, or even attacking or killing somebody because of different ethnicity or different race. So the term racism is often full with the whole notion of hatred of others. Now look how that's different to the term xenophobia. Any of the words with phobia in, phobia is actually used within mental health and psychiatry as to be a fear of something or an irrational fear. If a person is frightened of open spaces, then we say they have agoraphobia. If they're frightened of enclosed spaces, it's claustrophobia. If they're frightened of spiders, arachnophobia. So xenophobia literally means a fear of foreigners. So it could be that an individual is frightened of people of a particular ethnicity, but that fear isn't the same as the active hatred within racism. Now let's look at the next line down. Gynophobia or gynophobia, literally that means fear of women. And you might find that some men may say, well, look, I'm really frightened of having a woman as a boss. Especially in cultures where men are seen to be superior to women, and another term for that would be hegemony, hegemonic relations, where there's an uneven, in a negative way, an uneven power over. Okay, so one group have got the power, the others haven't. So in cultures where men can rise to the top and women can't, if that's reversed and a woman then gets the top job, you may get some men who will express being fearful of this change in gender relations. But also gynophobia could even refer to women themselves. Say if a young woman has been sexually abused as a child, she might fear growing into womanhood. She might fear the changes that her body will show, in case that means that more men may then abuse her as she was abused earlier. So gynophobia literally means fear of women or fear of womanhood. But that's totally different to the other term on that line that talks of misogyny. And that word in itself means a woman hater. So when we hear of men who commit crimes against women, whether this is intimate partner violence, domestic violence, rape, sexual abuse, torture, think of the cultures around the world which are war-torn at the moment, and think of some of the horrors being inflicted by men against women, and then sometimes men against other men. But from the point of view of the word misogyny, it refers to men who are haters of women. And when we consider the next few words, stigma, I've already mentioned, refers to a mark or a sign. And if something isn't talked about, if it's completely hidden and shrouded, then we could say that certain issues are taboo. Prejudice comes from two words meaning to prejudge. So if you consider that certain individuals are wrong or different or not normal, if you've already made up your mind about them, then that's prejudice. You've made a prejudgment. And if you act on that prejudgment in a negative way, that's what's referred to as discrimination, certainly negative discrimination. Here's the final list of a few words. Like with racism, I'm sure you've all come across the word sexism. So sexism, it's more often than not the domination of one sex or one gender over another. You may often think about it in relation to men who may tell sexist jokes, jokes which put women down. Okay, so a sexist joke. But then you may find some men who are totally dominant and domineering over women and constantly putting them down in life. And that would be some examples of sexism. So if you know what the word sexism means, consider for a moment what heterosexism is. So if sexism is seen as one sex over another, heterosexism would often be seen as heterosexuality over all others. Okay, so here's this dyadic relationship of one superior to another. When we come to the final four words here, I get stuck with some of these words because homophobia is often described as the irrational fear or hatred of homosexuals, so lesbian and gay people. But I would argue that sometimes the hatred, especially when you look around certain countries in the world at the moment where people can be executed or fired from their jobs or excluded from their families because of non-heterosexual orientations, then I would say that rather than homophobia, it's not so much a fear of, but it's more like the hatred involved in racism and sexism. So maybe we ought to rename this as homo-hatred rather than homophobia. And biphobia was a term that was coined in the 1970s when many people realized that bisexual people can have discrimination from heterosexuals and from lesbian and gay people, and therefore it's going to be different to homophobia. Transphobia is certainly a much newer term, and that's with the growing awareness that transsexual people can often receive different forms of abuse and discrimination for their life ways too. And erotophobia, anything that's erotic is to do with sex. So erotophobia could be fear of sex or maybe even fear of talking about sex. So in cultures that don't like talking about it, for example, I would say that's a form of cultural erotophobia, by which I mean that they're not happy in talking about sex. So let's look at a couple of definitions here. Heterosexism is defined as the institutional and individual assumption that everyone is heterosexual, and that heterosexuality is inherently superior to and preferable to homosexuality or bisexuality. But let's turn that definition around a minute. Supposing we just swapped a couple of the words there, and instead of talking about sexuality, let's talk about ethnicity. Let me read this to you again. How about if we said that racism is the institutional and individual assumption that everyone is white, and that whiteness is inherently superior to and preferable to blackness or yellowness? Now think how totally inappropriate that would be. So we know that racism is wrong, it's against the law, it's not tolerated in this country. But imagine we've got a really strong definition here of what racism is, but when it comes to sexual orientations, some people may feel that they're not treated as equally to others just because they don't identify exactly the same. And this is how they would be treated differently. Heterosexism often presumes that everyone's heterosexual. So when a lesbian or gay person comes out to someone, say to a friend, and if they say, by the way, there's something I need to tell you, I'm gay, and the individual might turn around and say to them, oh, well, you never told me that before, or why didn't you tell me any earlier? So there's this automatic assumption that everyone's straight until proved otherwise. But also, even within the straight world, look at the way in which monogamous and patriarchal heterosexuality is often seen to be the norm. So there's this movement towards the idea, well, boy meets girl, you get married, live happily ever after, and that anyone else is often treated quite differently. Now, we know that the majority of people in life don't meet that particular pattern, and yet it's sometimes enshrined within particular cultures, especially within religions. And therefore, if that's the way in which an individual operates, they're going to fear anything that's different. Here are some of the attributes of heterosexism which can have implications on an individual's health and well-being. First of all, it pathologizes all non-heterosexual orientations. So until the 1970s, within the UK and many other countries in the world, being non-heterosexual was in itself seen to be a mental condition. It isn't any longer. Also, if organizations are defining their needs with heterosexuality in mind, then of course that's going to exclude others. So supposing you work for an organization that says, well, all married people with children can have the month of August off. But supposing you're not heterosexual, supposing you're not married, and supposing you haven't got children, Does that mean that you're the one that then has to work every August time? So it defines itself in relation to privileges for those that fit into that model. And in doing that, it's invisibilizing all other people. And if you invisibilize other people and their needs, then you're certainly not treating them as being equal. When I mentioned that homophobia and biphobia are seen to be irrational fears or hatred of, here it says homosexuals and bisexuals. But the feelings of homophobia and biphobia, they can be external, that means coming from somebody else, or within the individual. And here are some of the attributes of homophobia. More often than not, it's expressed by males and usually against males. And it's often an expression that towards someone who isn't perceived as being as manly as men in that culture are meant to be. So when I said earlier about people being treated to the term gay in a negative way, it's because they're not perceived as being manly. But also with lesbians, look how many heterosexual men may tell you that they enjoy watching porn movies, for example, showing more than one woman having sex. So they're treating females as sex objects here, whereas in men, they would then be very hostile towards them. And also it treats bisexual people in many different ways, anything from the fact that, oh, they can't make up their mind or they're confused. And then secondly, it may treat them in the same way it treats lesbians or gay males. Here's a little cartoon, fortunately no longer relevant within the UK, but it's when people were using arguments for excluding gay and lesbian people within the armed forces. Have a look for a moment. Okay, and here are some of the attributes now of biphobia. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, bisexual people say that the prejudice and discrimination they receive often comes from both sides of the community, whether it's heterosexual or lesbian and gay. So if it's coming from heterosexuals, first of all, it treats bisexual men just as it treats gay men. And it treats some bisexual women as if they need converting back to heterosexuality. And when I say some women, it's because, again, think of the stereotypes of lesbian women. Say, for example, if a woman's perceived to be young, slim, beautiful, wearing lipstick, trendy looking, attributes like that, they may be referred to as femme or lipstick dykes. And then sometimes you may see some lesbians who are stereotypically more manly looking. And that's where some of the heterosexual males would think that these women are so manly looking that I'm not interested in them at all, because they're more like me than like the femme type of woman that I would normally prefer. So there's a difference how biphobia is projected onto females, and it's sometimes to do with their own character, their persona, and the way they look. But also biphobia can come from lesbian and gay people too. And sometimes it's as if lesbian and gay people are saying to bisexuals, well, look, you want the best of both worlds. You're a married man and you're in this gay bar at the minute. You're flirting with me now. We may have sex together. But if there's any homophobia around, you're happy enough to run back to wifey and play happy families again. Okay, so it's seen that they want the best of both worlds, that they can't make up their mind. Even some of the nicknames for bisexual people, whether they were AC, DC, they want their cake and eat it. Think of some of the stereotypical ways they're treated. Now, when it comes to attitudes of transphobia, I'm not going to give you any examples here, but I'm going to ask you to think about it and actually come back to us on your Moodle forum site. So give us some examples of what you consider may be stigma, prejudice or discrimination towards transsexual people. And what we need to realise with all of these phobias, prejudices, hatreds, whatever we want to call them, that they can be internalised within the individual. And especially with a young person, in the formative years of their lives, if they're being treated in a discriminatory way, that can really leave a negative mark on them, and certainly not do good for their own self-esteem and their well-being. So they may internalize some of this hatred, shame, or discrimination. But also it comes out between individuals. So the way individuals may use nasty words towards others or treat them in a derogatory way is because of these phobias and prejudices. But in many of our cultures, then such discrimination is already built in. And again, look at the way in which non-heterosexual people are treated and how women are treated in many parts of the world. When anybody is uplifted because of their gender or orientation at the expense of putting down somebody else, this refers to the cultural and institutional nature of discrimination. Sometimes this is overt, it's out in the open. Other times it's going to be quite hidden. But we need to realise, especially in relation to lesbian and gay people, that being gay or lesbian is not genetically or biologically hazardous, but the risk factors are conferred through homophobia. So when you hear that there are more lesbian and gay people with some mental health problems compared to their heterosexual brothers and sisters, it's not by being gay or lesbian that's conferring the mental health status, but usually suffering with the prejudice and discrimination that they've had to deal with within life. But I know throughout this presentation I've sometimes been talking in dyadic ways, male, female, gay, straight, but we've got to realise it isn't like that at all. What we need to be looking at is for the sexual health and well-being of all individuals within their wider determinants of health. What are the preventable issues compared to those which are inevitable? And most negative health conditions are preventable. But some of the barriers, some of the restraining factors are because of the prejudice and discrimination that we've already seen. So if you have a person who's suffering because of their gender or their sexual orientation, and that's having an impact on their health esteem, then obviously it's having a knock-on impact on their mental health and well-being, and it's having an impact on whether they're even going to look after themselves using condoms during sex. We've almost finished now, and right towards the end I just want to mention the impact of social difference, especially from negative point of views. So stigmatizing others for their difference, treating others with discrimination, and denying others their needs and even the very fact that they exist will bound to lead to misinformation and stereotyping, exclusion through invisibilization, and lack of equality. And in the blurbs coming up around you, look at the way that has a negative impact on the wider determinants of a person's health and well-being. But let's turn all of that round with a positive, because when many people are suffering like this, within them there may be those seeds of resilience, a dynamism, a desire, a want, a change to do something to turn around the negativities that they're experiencing in life. So although this aspect seems rather negative, for many people they'll come out the other end. And certainly when you consider young people who don't identify as being heterosexual, and maybe they're excluded from their families, and they may move to other towns or cities, or sometimes even to other countries, to be accepted for who they are. That's a sign of resilience, and that maybe they've had to move away from their family by birth, and certainly be integrated into a family by choice. And for the very last time, here are some more questions that I would really appreciate your feedback on. First of all, any of the stuff that we've been doing now around genders and sexualities, or any of the issues I've mentioned, would you like to know more about any of that? And if so, would you like those of us who are teaching at the university to present more sessions to you on your various courses? And if you need more information, then certainly ask your course leaders to put you in touch with some of us working within sexual health. I thank you for listening to this presentation, and I really look forward to reading what you're going to be saying on your Moodle site. Thank you. Bye-bye.